We're into a new section now, and in this section we're going to be extending our knowledge of effects. I'll quickly explain what we've got. I've got 2 video tracks here with a clip on each. We've not got their embedded audio. I've deleted those. We don't really need them for what I'm about to show you. Well, as you can see, on video track 1, we've got that clip numbered as 70 with video clip 67 on video track 2. Now, in terms of visibility, whatever is on the top track, in this case number 67, well, that completely obscures whatever is below on video track 1. Certainly set like this with the opacity set to 100%. So visibility then, as we can see, works by top down, similar to way as we were talking about playing cards previously. If we have a king of clubs on top of an ace of spades, then it's the king of clubs that we can see, even though the ace of spades might be a better card. If you want to reverse these tracks, well, of course you can do. For example, with number 70 on video track 1, if I left click it, and I'll just move it out of the way a little bit, which means I can drag number 67 from video track 2 down onto video track 1, and consequently replace what was on video track 2 with clip number 70. Which means, of course, clip number 70 is what we see. It takes precedence over what's below it. Okay, now I'm just going to reverse that. I'll go back to where we were. I'll shuffle these out of the way and replace. Okay, done. We're now back to where we were with clip 67 on video track 2. Consequently, that's why we can see that clip in our program monitor above. Okay, now for the rest of this tutorial, I want to talk about effects, video effects, and how we can easily find effects when we want to apply them to any clip of our choice, and then subsequently change back to where we were if that's what we decide to do. Now what I could be doing is coming over to the effects panel and digging through the video effects category, looking for a specific effect that I want to use. Perhaps I want to use a black and white filter and place it on one of my clips. Well, unless I know exactly where it is, it can be a little bit tiresome searching around for the particular effect that you want to use. So instead of doing that, I'm going to use this search field just above. As soon as I start to type in the effect that I'm looking for, i.e. black and white, well, in this case I only have to get as far as BLA before I can now see automatically open up within our video effects the relevant folder image control, and within there I can see black and white. Noticing also just below, because BLA is the beginning of black, we also see any other filters that contain the word black. So in video transitions below that, and then in dissolve, we see dip to black. Anyway, regardless, we want the black and white filter, so I'll left click on it and drag and drop onto my top clip on video track 2. And as a result, as we would expect, in the program monitor now, we see this clip on video track 2 taking on this black and white look. And I actually quite like it, to be honest. I like that monochromatic look. It makes it quite moody. And in actual fact, this scene was filmed in the summertime, or thereabouts anyway, but that view now, with the monochrome look, reminds me of what it's like in the winter. Anyway, I want to extend our knowledge of filters now by talking about a reset button that we can use with pretty much any filter. However, with some, it doesn't work. I'm going to give you an example with this black and white filter. First of all, I need to make sure my clip is selected on video track 2, and then I'll open up my effect controls panel, and there you'll see below our motion and opacity and time remapping filters that are always there, we now see any filters that we've added in. In this case, we've added in this black and white filter. Well, imagine I wanted to see what this looked like prior to imposing this monochromatic filter. Well, you would imagine I would be able to come over here. You'll see this on every effect. Well, pretty much anyway. You can see it on motion and opacity above. This is the reset effect button. If you click it, you would imagine we would revert back to the full color version of this clip. But as you can see, no matter how many times I click it, frustratingly, we don't revert back. And that's with this black and white filter. Other filters work exactly as you want them to. So you might be asking, isn't there anything we can do about this so that we can see what it looks like prior to trying this effect? Well, there is. In fact, there are a couple of things that we can do, and I'm going to try and show you both of these in this tutorial. If I don't manage it in the available time for this tutorial, we'll pick up again in the following tutorial, where we will have seen both solutions by then. One solution is to come over here to where it says Effects, FX, just to the left of black and white. This allows you to toggle the effect on and off. I'm going to leave it on for the moment. We'll get back to this later, because by contrast I want to show you what we can do down here. On track 2 here, on video track 2, you can see we've got this button. This button will be on every track. Well, this allows you to toggle the track output on or off. Effectively, it's a mute, a visible mute. It deactivates everything on this track. So be careful with this. If you've got multiple clips running along this track, maybe you've got 10 or 11 different clips. If you select this button, then what you are doing is making everything invisible on this track, all 10 or 11 clips. That might not be what you want. You might only want to make a couple of those clips invisible. Well, you would need to adjust the opacity for individual clips if that's the case. We'll get onto this in a moment. But as you can see, or rather you can't see, as I engage this and visibly mute whatever is on video track 2, we now see in our program monitor anything below it, in our case on video track 1, clip number 70. I'll toggle the visibility back on again, and of course now we see the black and white view there. Okay, now I am actually going to make it invisible for the moment, and that's only because I want to leave that black and white effect in place. But I want to actually work with some other filters, some other video effects on the clip below on video track 1. So I want to be able to see what I'm doing, of course, within our program monitor. Now I'm going to pause here for this tutorial, and I'm going to pick up again in the following tutorial where we've just left off. Welcome back. Let's continue from where we left off. Okay, now I actually want to use the sharpen filter, so I'll just click on this cross here to clear my search field and then type in sharpen. Unfortunately, there are quite a few different sharpen filters, so I have to know which one I want. Well, that's fine because I know it's this one in the blur and sharpen category, this one called sharpen. I'll left click on it and I'll drag it over and drop it on video track 1 onto clip number 70 there. As a consequence of this, in the Effect Controls panel, we now see this Sharpen filter has been added, ready for us to adjust it as necessary, because with this type of effect, it's been brought in, but without the effect being applied. We have to now apply it. In this case, how much sharpening do we want to impose on this video clip? What I could do is left click here where it says 0 at the moment, and I could drag to the right. Alternatively, clicking on this twirl arrow here reveals this slider just below. So I can left click on the slider and drag it to the right until I see the right amount of sharpening for my eye. I'll take it to its extreme. And so now, with our reset parameter button, this will work. As you can see now, if I click on it, that drag slider that we've just moved right across to the right has now reverted back to its neutral position of 0, i.e. no sharpening is taking effect. As I say, alternatively, left click on the number here and drag to the right if you prefer to do it that way. Irrespective of which way you do it, this reset button is going to work exactly the same way, as we would expect. Okay, now I want to keep this sharpen effect in place, so I am going to leave it there. I'll just close it down out of view a little bit, so we've got some more space within the Effect Controls panel. And I'm doing this because I want to show you how we stack effects. With that sharpening effect already in place, we've not deleted it, we've not removed it, have we? Although I've left it at 0, I could do with adding some in, but for the moment I'll leave it as it is. For our purposes it is still working, it's in place. So I want to add in another effect on top of this effect, and I've used that phrase on purpose, on top of our effect, because that's what we're doing. We are stacking effects. Whatever we place first will filter in that way, and then whatever we do again will filter not the original video, but the video with what we've just done with filter number 1. So for the example with the black and white filter, if we add that monochrome filter first of all, and then we add some blur, what we are doing is blurring the black and white version. We're not blurring the color version and then adding black and white. The stacking order is whatever we place first occurs first, and then our next filter modifies further from that point. Anyway, let's add another filter. I'll clear my search field. I actually want to use a filter called three-way color corrector. So you would imagine I could simply type in my search field here 3, the number there, but unfortunately I don't seem able to find the particular filter that I want to use. As you can see, the only filter that reveals is that one in perspective, basic 3D. Well, that's because I've used the number rather than the word 3, and that's really important. This search field operates exactly. So because the filter I want uses the word 3 and not the number 3, it can't find it. So no matter what else I add in here, it really is irrelevant. It's not going to find what I'm looking for. I happen to know it's inside this color correction folder. I'll just scroll down a little. There it is towards the bottom, three-way color corrector. And you can see there we have the word 3 rather than the number. So imagine I didn't know it was there. If I type in the word 3, well, as you can see, Fantastic, Premiere Pro now finds it for me. So that means I can left click and drag it over to my clip there on video track 1. Now to be able to access this at this screen size, I need to drag down this panel, and there you will see the 3-way color corrector filter is in place. And the way that this effect controls panel works is that whatever effect that we've got at the top, well, that gets applied first, and then whatever's below gets applied next. So in this case, sharpen gets applied first, and 3-way color corrector gets applied second. Therefore, in this example, we are color correcting the sharpened version of our clip. As a quick look at what we can do with this, click on the center dot there and adjust as necessary. Just before I do, notice we don't appear to have a reset button, that revert back button that we saw earlier. That said, there is an overall one, but for individual dials, for shadows, midtones and highlights, notice that as I do adjust, then we get that little reset button just around about 2 o'clock for each of those dials. Which means, of course, if I want to revert back to the default for that dial, I could click on the independent revert buttons. If I wanted to correct them all simultaneously, then there is the main revert button to the right of 3-way color corrector. Okay, now I'll just collapse my 3-way color corrector out of sight a little bit, and I'll resize these panels once more. Okay, now as a reminder, we've got video track 1 and video track 2, but so far we've disabled our view of video track 2. I'll bring it back into view by selecting here again. As we can see in the program monitor, that takes precedence in terms of visibility. And if I select the clip, then you can see in the effect controls panel, there is that black and white filter that we've imposed on it. Now you remember me saying that this black and white filter can't be adjusted. The effect is either on or it's off. The revert button doesn't seem to take any effect. So are we actually stuck with this, with it being on or off? Well, not exactly. We can blend our clip so we get a sort of desaturated look, not completely black and white, but retaining as much of the original color as we want. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to pick up again in the following tutorial. Let's continue from where we left off. Now I'm going to be talking about the opacity of this clip. I'll select it and come up to my effect controls up here, and there you'll see I've got opacity, as we always have for every single type of clip. Well, I don't mean that we use opacity to fade it away, because all that's going to do in this case is show a percentage value of our clip, maybe 50% of it, but blended with whatever's below. So that's not exactly what I'm looking for. I'll show you what I mean. I'll reveal the opacity parameters, and you can see I've got my opacity set to 100%. Actually, just before we do look at that, notice down here we have this blend mode. If you are a Photoshop user, you'll probably know all about blending different types of clip, or rather, within Photoshop, different layers imposed on the same image. Well, here this blend mode works in pretty much the same way. Click on the drop arrow there, and then choose one of these. If I choose darken, for example, well, that sort of works with this because we've got a blend of both clips. And it seems now that those 3 people walking across the rocks there are walking towards that hotel which is right in the distance on the sea front. And this is only achieved by using this darken blending mode. Let's try the opposite. I'll drop down and choose lighten. Okay, so that's not quite as satisfactory. That doesn't quite work in the same way. It might be the effect that you are looking for, but in our example, it's not quite what I want. So I'm going to revert back to normal, meaning that video track 2 dominates video track 1 below. Okay, now getting back to opacity. If I drag this down, then we're not quite achieving what I want to achieve, because even though I take it right down, all I'm doing is making it invisible, meaning whatever's below on video track 1 now emerges and becomes dominant. So I'll take that back to 100%. That's not going to work for us. Perhaps if I come down to video track 1 and toggle this off so that we can't actually see video track 1, even if video track 2 wasn't there. Well, let me try the opacity once more. This time, rather than using the percentage number and dragging, I'll reveal the slider and I'll drag it down from 100%. And as I drag it down, well, all I'm now doing is showing the black canvas behind. So again, not exactly what I'm looking for. This isn't the desaturated monochrome look that I want. So I'll revert back to 100% and I'll come down to video track 2, because what we need to do with this monochrome filter, we need to duplicate our clip on video track 2. So what I could do is left click on it here and drag it up where there isn't a video track 3 at the moment, but because I am dragging it up and disengaging, then that will automatically create that new video track for me. Okay, so now what I need to do is make a copy of that clip, and I can do it by right clicking on it there and choosing copy, and then now because my CTI is at the beginning, I can use the shortcut Ctrl+V to paste in exactly that clip onto my video track 2. So now we do have two identical copies of that clip. However, because we have made a direct copy, both of these clips take on that black and white filter. While I don't want the black and white filter to be on the bottom clip, what I mean is the bottom of those two clips, the one on video track 2, I want that one to be in color. So with it selected, I can click on here to disengage the effect entirely, to bypass it. I'm not removing it, I'm simply bypassing it, although it would be just as well to remove it. But anyway, for our example, I will bypass. Remembering, of course, because it's on video track 2, we can't see the effect of that, i.e. it reverting back to being in color, because on video track 3, which takes precedence in the stacking order, well, that's still visible. If I toggle track 3 off, then it means that's invisible, and what is below it on video track 2 is what we see, i.e. our color clip version now. Okay, now I'll toggle that back on again so that we see video track 3 with the black and white effect still in place, and I'm going to adjust the visibility of track 3. Now just so that we can see things better at this screen size, I'll just drag this down and then I'll enlarge video track 3, and that's only because I can see this horizontal opacity line better. Well now, if I left click on this opacity line and drag down, you can now see by whatever percentage value, and this is around about 50%, you can now see that the colour bleeds through, shall we say, from the identical clip below. So we get a sort of more moody grey winter scene rather than the summer scene with those rich oranges and yellows. And all you would need to do, of course, is adjust the opacity to suit your eye. Okay, I'll finish up here then. Now that we've seen a couple of tutorials talking about effects and stacking effects and visibility and essentially track management really. Once you have applied some effects to a particular clip, and I'm talking about one effect or two or three, so singular or multiple effects, once these are applied to a particular clip and you like the look of it, it would be quite useful, I suppose, if we could save that so we didn't have to replicate it each time that we wanted to use the same preset pattern, shall we say, on a different clip. Well, of course we can, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here, creating presets. You'll remember over our last few tutorials, we had these multi-video tracks. We had 3. One was a copy. Now I'm going to remove that top one. We don't really need it for our purposes here. By the way, we will revisit this in more detail later. So for now, I'll right-click on video track 3 and select delete track. I want to keep video track 1 and video track 2 because I'm going to apply some effects to the top clip and then use that preset and apply it to our bottom clip. So as a reminder of our effects in place, the clip on video track 2, I'll select that, and if I go up to effect controls, notice our black and white filter is in place. Well, I want to combine this with another effect, well in fact a couple of effects. So to start off, I'll go down to the effects panel and I'll open up the generate folder. I need to scroll down and I'll choose lens flare. I'll select it and drag and drop onto video track 2 on our clip there. And now we see the black and white filtered clip with some lens flare. Okay, now I'll just collapse our lens flare category in the effect controls, and I'll also collapse the generate folder in our effects panel. I'm now going to try out a couple of different effects. I'm not sure how successful they'll be, but I can always delete them if they're no use. So I'll start off by opening up our stylize folder and, well, I'm not sure which one to go for. I'll choose this one, roughen edges. So I'll drag and drop this onto our clip. Now set like this, it's not had much if any effect. So what I would need to do is adjust these parameters in the effect controls panel. In this case though, I think I'll decide not to use it. So simply to remove it, I'll go up to edit and hit undo. Okay, we've now removed that filter. Let's try another more obvious filter now. I'll choose mosaic from the same category and I'll drag and drop this onto our clip. Now maybe this is too extreme. We see a very pixelated or mosaic view of our clip in the program monitor. So what I could do is I could go up to mosaic in my effect controls to adjust the two parameters, horizontal and vertical. They're both on 10 to start off with. So let's adjust to see if we can make this better. I'll open up the horizontal drag slider and I'll take it from 10 and I'll take it right up to, well, around about 176 there. And now I'll open up the vertical drag slider and I'll take this from 10 to 56. And now we do get that pixelated or mosaic view, but we can still tell what the clip is. Okay, now let's use this combination of effects and parameter changes as a preset. I'll just collapse and resize my panels and the screen size so that we can refocus on what we're doing. Okay, now to create a preset from multiple effects, or indeed this could be one, means selecting all three. As I say, the principle applies even if this was for one effect that we wanted to create a preset out of. Also remember that this preset that we are saving will run in exactly this order: black and white filter, the lens flare, and then the mosaic. Okay, now my first step is to select all three effects, black and white, lens flare and mosaic. And now that I've got them all selected, well, one method is to right click and then I can choose Save Preset. Alternatively, you can come up to your context menu here at the top right of your panel, click on that drop reveal arrow there and choose Save Preset. Of course, now our Save Preset dialog opens up, and in the name field I'm going to change it from black and white there. I'm going to change it to VTC1. I'm going to leave everything else as it is and simply OK it. Right, I'll just resize my panels again so that we can see our sequence panel better. OK, now first of all, I need to click the visibility button there for video track 2 so that we only see video track 1 in our program monitor. Okay, now I'll select the clip on video track 1. Now I need to deselect the visibility so that we actually do see it for video track 1. And I'll select our clip and finally come back over to the effects panel and select the presets category. And now within here, we've now got this one preset, the one that we've just saved, VTC1. So I'll drag and drop this clip down onto my clip. And now you can see that that clip takes on exactly that preset. It's now been transformed into a black and white, lens flared, mosaic version of it. I'll look at using a new technique to us of achieving a similar outcome to what we've seen so far. The outcome I'm talking about is getting the black and white filter to fade over time so that we gradually desaturate its effect. We do this by employing two video tracks, one a duplicate of the other, and using what are known as keyframes or key points to stipulate where we would like a key moment to occur, hence the term keyframes. Our key moments here will only be 2, but the principle remains the same, even if you use 3, 4, 5, 10 or whatever. Anyway, let's look at what we have set up here. Here are our 2 clips on different video tracks. I say different clips, they're the same, one's a duplicate of the other. At present we can see this clip on video track 1 because it's visible, but the track 2 video is deactivated. Therefore we see the colour version of the clip within the program monitor. And if I select it, you'll see there are no effects integrated. By contrast, selecting the video track 2 clip shows the black and white filter is being employed. We can't see it though because, as said, our track output button is toggled off. I'll click to toggle it on. OK, we now see the same scene in black and white. Right, let's go about fading the output from black and white into colour. I need to go to my Effect Controls panel once my clip 2 on track 2 there is selected. And just to make this clearer, I'm going to resize the Effect Controls panel by left-clicking and dragging to the right to enlarge it. And now we see a timeline view of this clip only, with the relevant horizontal time ruler above. You can place your CTI along the duration up here, but of course it's all in black and white throughout its length. No matter where we place the CTI along its duration, of course it's going to be in black and white. Also notice that where you place the CTI is also reflected on the main timeline down here. Now, to use keyframes to create a fade, we need to initially create points at which are key to our fade. And we add keyframes by clicking this small diamond button. This is the button to add or remove keyframes. Now at present the CTI is at the start and is displaying this clip at 100% opacity with its black and white filter employed. I'll click to add my first keyframe here, and you'll notice now that we see a small diamond keyframe added to the timeline here. This sets the opacity at 100% at this point. Now I'll just move my CTI along the timeline a little to around about 8 seconds in, or alternatively you can move your CTI down here in the sequence panel timeline too. I'll move to closer to the end at near enough to 10 seconds along. Once I add another keyframe here in a moment, I can reduce the opacity of this clip at this 10-second position, so that upon playback at this point, the clip will be invisible if I set the opacity to 0%. And the fact the movement from the start keyframe to here is gradual will mean the fade from black and white to colour will be gradual. The colour will seem to emerge through. So I'll come back up here and click to add the second keyframe at this point. Okay, there's our second keyframe added, and you can also see it clearly on the opacity line down in the sequence panel. Now, one way of reducing the opacity, as we've seen before in other tutorials, is to left click and drag down on the timeline down here to see it register, in this case at the moment at 29%, pretty much quarter visibility. Alternatively, left click and drag this scrubby version up here where the number is, left click, and then drag from 29% to 0%, and that will mean full invisibility for this black and white version of the clip. Now you might have noticed I've just accidentally hit the add keyframe diamond. Well, there's no need to panic. I can remove this in a second. Before I do, note that you can use the opacity slider here to reset to a different percentage value. Okay, now I'll leave it at 0% now. And now let's remove the extra keyframe added by mistake. In the Effect Controls panel, you can use your horizontal zoom slider to zoom in, and now we see both keyframes at the end. And because we've zoomed right in, they are further apart. Relatively anyway. Their position stays exactly where they were. Zooming in like this of course means they appear to be further apart, but the distance between them is actually the same, regardless of whether we are zoomed in or zoomed out. Which means now I can select the one I don't want and click once more on this keyframe diamond to remove it. So that's what that keyframe button is. You can either add, if there is no keyframe there, and if you do have a keyframe, well, by selecting it, then by clicking on here once more, we'll remove it. It doesn't mute it, it removes it. By the way, these arrows either side of the keyframe diamond means you can jump backwards or forward to the next keyframe, like this. So with this one selected now, I'll reduce the opacity from 28% right down to 0%. Now I'm just going to refocus my screen a little, just to save you some time. Okay, and now I'll manually move my CTI by clicking across this timeline up here, so that we can see the fade from black and white to colour. There's a little bit of colour emerging here, and a little bit more over here, until we get to the end of course, when all the colour from the original clip on video track 1 will be showing through, because we will have reduced the opacity for video track 2 down to 0%, hence making it invisible. Let's have a look at this in action. I'll move my CTI to the start, so let's watch it live. I'll hit play. Okay, so that's what we can do with keyframes then, when we want to overcome problems, in our example here, of moving from a black and white filter into colour. Of course, this isn't the only reason why we would use keyframes, and we are going to explore keyframes further as we progress. Now that we've seen how to add in keyframes and how useful they can be, in this tutorial I'm going to add some more keyframes in onto this one clip. But I'm only doing this because I want to show you how easy it is to edit these keyframes after we've added them. And whilst I'm doing this, I'm going to add a video effect that is very dramatic, simply so that we can see this in much more detail. So I'll come down to the effects panel and open up the video effects folder. The particular effect I want to use is down here in this stylize folder. So I'll open this up and then drag down. I'm looking for the find edges one. There it is. Now you've probably noticed these are in alphabetical order. Ordinarily, you should be able to double click on the effect that you want to use and immediately have this applied to your clip. However, it won't work at the moment because I've not got the clip selected. And I suppose that makes sense really, because if you've got multiple clips and none of them are selected and you double clicked on an effect, well, you don't really know which one it's going to apply to, do you? So you have to make sure it's selected if you are going to double click. In this case, because it isn't selected, I'll left click on Find Edges here and drag, and this time drop it on top of the clip. The end result is the same. This Find Edges filter is applied. Okay, and there you'll see it up in the program monitor. Quite a dramatic look. If you're trying to make a science fiction film, then this is the ideal filter for you. Let's play it through. I'll hit the play button. Okay, quite dramatic. Very much like a cartoon, or at least a line drawing version of a cartoon. Okay, let's see what we can do with keyframes then. Making sure my clip is selected, I'll come up to the Effect Controls panel, and there you'll see that Find Edges filter is in place as we would expect. By the way, if you want to make it even more dramatic, notice this checkbox here, this invert checkbox. By clicking in there, well, you now see that not only is this a very unusual science fiction looking scene, but now we've made it a nighttime version of this science fiction scene. Okay, now actually I think I'm going to leave it like that, just for our example. Now at the moment my CTI is right at the beginning of the clip, and this will mean of course that this Find Edges filter is applied right across the clip because we've not added in any keyframes as of yet. What we're going to do in a moment is we're going to blend this with the original, in that as soon as I hit this button here, I've added in a keyframe right on the first frame of our clip. And that will mean at this position we aren't blending this with the original version because we're set at 0%. What we're going to do in a moment is we're going to change this to 100%, and that will mean on this first frame we will see the original version because we've blended out this affected version, and then as we progress we'll have this fade away from the original version and morph, shall we say, or transform into this science fiction version. So what we need to do next is place our CTI right at the end of our clip, or rather we don't want it exactly at the end of our clip, because in essence what we are doing is we are at the beginning of the next clip, albeit there isn't one there at the moment. But if I move my CTI right to the end, then what we are doing is we're picking up the first frame of what could be the next clip. What we need is the last frame of our clip, this existing one, or at least a few frames in from it. So by placing my CTI pretty much to the end there, rather than right at the end, what you can do is, if you do place it at the end and you want to bring it in one frame at a time, then clicking on this button will allow you to do it. Okay, so bring it in a couple of frames if you prefer. For our example, here's fine. Therefore now I can click on the Add Keyframe button once more, and there you'll see we've now got these two keyframes. Admittedly, they are both exactly the same despite their distance apart. We've not blended either of these keyframes with the original, or done anything else for that matter. So this very last keyframe, our second one, if we zoom right in on it, then you can see at the moment our blend with the original slider is still set to 0%, which is exactly the same as the first keyframe. I'll move to the first keyframe by clicking on this back button here. As we remember from what I said previously, this will take the CTI to the next keyframe, either forwards or backwards in this case, and as it turns out, the first frame of our clip. By the way, there are a few things that you can do by clicking on this effects here. Dropping down, you'll see that you can go right down to the bottom and drop on Find Edges. But we can't really add any keyframes by doing this method. We can change either parameter, we can invert, or we can blend with the original. Okay, now I'm just pointing that out so you know it's there. Anyway, let's get back up to our effect controls so that we can modify our keyframes. Okay, now with us being on our first keyframe, and it's set to 0% in terms of blending, we could either type in 100% there, so we see fully the original version, i.e. without this effect, or we can reveal here and use this drag slider. It's up to you. I'm going to use this drag slider, so I'll left click and drag to the right, so now it says 100%, and of course this means that our first frame, as I've been saying, doesn't take on that effect at all, this Find Edges effect. However, what you will notice, you'll see this descending ramp. And what this means is, on our first keyframe, we are set to 100%, as it is here, and our last keyframe, the second one, that will move right down to 0%. And we will see as the playback starts, there will be that gradual change, that morphing into the second version, with the Find Edges effect applied. You can see as I move my CTI across, how this is going to look. Okay, now I'll just go back to the beginning, and we'll watch it through. I'll click the play button. Okay, so you can see the gradual movement between the original and our Find Edges version at the end. Well, that's all well and good if you're happy with this ramp moving from the beginning to the end in one smooth movement, but maybe you want a couple of seconds at the beginning where it still retains the original view. Well, by placing your CTI here, at the moment we see the blending mode is set to 77%. Well, if I want to make this 100% instead, well, first of all, I'll click on here to add another keyframe, and there you see it added. We've got that diamond there. Incidentally, if we just close this up so that we only see the name of the effect applied, Find Edges, we now don't see any diamonds, we just see these circles instead. These are simply here to indicate that there is a keyframe. You can't actually adjust these because these aren't the keyframes themselves. These are just indicators that once we reveal our Find Edges effect, that there is a keyframe here. So as I say, you can't actually move any of these. They are simply there as an indicator. So let's open up once more, and now you'll see that that circle turns into a diamond, which is the actual keyframe itself. So now if I left click on it and I want to adapt it or move it somewhere else, then as you can see, it's that easy. Now I'm going to take it back to where my CTI is. What I could do at this point is simply change where it says 77% into 100%. Perhaps that's the quickest way, but an alternate method is to go to your first keyframe and then right click on it and run down to copy. Then by using this right arrow button to navigate to my second keyframe, with it selected there now, I can right click and drop down, not to copy this time, but to paste, so that any keyframe parameter that we picked up from our first keyframe has been copied and applied to our second one. Hence that's why now it says 100%. And you can see if I drag my CTI in between these two keyframes, we now see the original clip without any blending at all. And in fact, if I open this up, you'll see that horizontal straight line in between our first two keyframes at 100%, and it's only at that position, the second keyframe, that we descend with that blending ramp until we morph into the Find Edges effect at the end. Right, let's have one last look. I'll make sure I'm at the beginning and I'll hit play. Okay, and that's it really. That's all we need to do when we want to edit keyframes. One of the more remarkable effects that I'm sure you're going to use is what's known as the warp stabilizer effect. I think you will use it an awful lot if you do a lot of handheld filming. The warp stabilizer effect comes into its own for this project whereby all the footage was handheld. If you look at the clip at the moment that's in my program monitor, it's a little bit shaky. I'm going to hit play so that you can watch this back. As you can see, it is quite shaky. I want to try and lock down this movement as much as I can. To do this, we need to use the warp stabilizer effect, and we access it in our effects panel. And then within my video effects folder, the warp stabilizer effect is in this subfolder, distort. You'll find it at the bottom there. I'm going to left click on the warp stabilizer and I'm going to drag it and drop it exactly on top of my clip on video track 1. When I do, notice what happens in the program monitor. Also in the effect controls. I'll left click on the effect and drag and drop onto my clip. There you'll see in the program monitor that this warp stabilizer effect is step 1 of 2. It is analyzing in the background. It's analyzing every single frame. And once every single frame has been analyzed in my program monitor, you'll notice we now get that band running across saying that this effect is taking place. My first option is I want smooth motion. If I use the drop reveal there, you'll notice I either want smooth motion or no motion. Well, I'm going to go for smooth motion. I'll leave my smoothness set to 50%. In terms of the method, I'm going to go for subspace warp. In general, I find that works the best, or at least is a good starting point. But choose one of these other three, position or position scale, rotation or perspective. I am going to leave it at stabilize, crop, auto scale, and you can see my auto scale ever so slightly. I've had to zoom in rather than it being at 100%, it's just gone up to 101%. That simply means that to be able to stabilize the footage so that it doesn't shake around so much, we've slightly zoomed in whilst the remaining pixels on our screen have now been smoothed out, i.e. they've been stabilized. You'll probably notice with really shaky footage, if you have your framing set to stabilize, crop, auto scale, with really shaky footage your auto scale goes up quite a lot. As it is, this is a little bit shaky, but not too bad. So as I say, just click on the drop reveal here, and you'll see these 4 separate options. I'm going to go for the stabilize, crop, auto scale. However, notice the last option, stabilize, synthesize edges. That might be useful if you don't really want to crop your clips. What would happen is the black edges, the black borders that inevitably occur, well, the edges of your frame, the edges of your clip will be synthesized in that they will be partially copied and the resulting black border, or the frame, will be filled in based on the edge elements of your clip. I'm not a big fan of it, to be honest, but try it out, see if it does work better with your clips. If you really want to go into some advanced details, then you'll notice the advanced section here. Before I make any other changes, I want to play this back just to check it out first of all. Prior to doing that though, I want to render this. I'll come up to Sequence and drop down to Render Effects, and the rendering takes place. Once done, I can play it. Before I do, I'm going to mute the audio. I'll now come back up to see what this looks like, and click on play. To my eyes, that's not done such a bad job. There still is a little bit of shake there, although I don't really mind that so much. That said, I think I'll take my smoothness up here to 100% to see what the result is like. So rather than typing in 100%, I'll drop here and then drag this slider. As soon as I do, we don't need to analyze every frame again, but the effect has to stabilize the footage once more, as you can tell by the band running across there. Notice now, auto scale has ever so slightly crept up, and that should give you an indication about how the auto scale works to zoom in on the footage when it's stabilizing it. Right, let me render it once more, and once we have rendered it once more, then I want to play this back to see what it's like, so I'll hit play. Again, to my eyes, that's even better than it was a few moments ago. And really, overall, I think this warp stabilizer effect has done a remarkable job. Certainly when we remember that this is simply handheld footage. I realise, like me, you probably take a long time capturing your footage and making sure that it's at the best quality that you can shoot it at. And therefore, using a video effect, such as blurring, does seem counterproductive to your workflow. However, you can use blur as an effect in a creative way, not just to blur the whole image, but also, as we'll see during this tutorial, certain elements within your video. Well, they can be blurred, whilst other parts remain sharp, dependent on the type of blur filter that you use. Now, actually kind of contradictory to what I've just been talking about in terms of blur, as I've just referenced sharpening an image, let's look at that first. I'll come down to my video effects folder and open up this category here, blur and sharpen. So you can see immediately Adobe regards these two types of filter to be complementary. And as you can see, once I open this folder up, there are quite a number of each of those different types, some blur and some sharpen. Admittedly, the vast majority are blur, but we'll start with a sharpen effect. This one pretty much down at the bottom, the penultimate one, so I'll left click on sharpen and drag it over and drop it onto our clip. Consequently, within our effect controls panel, we now see this sharpen effect implemented. And as you can see by default, it's brought in at quite a low level, the sharpen amount there being 9, and maybe that's my advice really. Keep your sharpen amount to be fairly low. I know that's not always possible, but in this case I don't really need to drag it too far to the right. As you can see, if I take this up to 45, then perhaps it's a little bit too much. And in fact, if I come over here to my program monitor, see here where it says quarter. Well, this indicates that upon playback, what you will see in the program monitor will be quarter resolution, i.e. quarter quality. Well, for our purposes, I'm going to take this up to full, so later, if I do play this back, at least I'll see the effect this sharpen amount has on this clip in full resolution. By the way, regardless of what you've got this set to, full, quarter or half, when not in playback mode, the still frame that you see will be at full quality. That's why sometimes you see it flick around between the very sharp version of it and a more softer version. Anyway, as I say, I wouldn't take this too far to the right, this sharpen amount. Pretty much right across here, close to 100, will probably be too much. So I'll reduce it. Now I'm giving this advice. Of course I can't see your footage, so you are going to have to experiment with this. But if you remember, less is more, you probably won't go wrong. Okay, so that's the sharpen effect. Now I can either click in here to deactivate it, or if I want to completely remove it, right click and run down to clear. Okay, so that's sharpening your video. Let's do the antithesis now. I'll choose a blur. As you can see, we have got quite a number of different blur effects to choose from, but the one I use pretty much all the time is this Gaussian blur. Although, to be fair, sometimes I use the channel blur. We'll get onto that later. For the moment though, let's look at this Gaussian blur. I'll left click and drag this onto our clip now. Once I do, in my effect controls, yes, the Gaussian blur is in place, but by default it's set to neutral, i.e. 0. Now before I actually add any blur in, I want to open this up because I want to show you these options here. Blur dimensions, Presently it's set to horizontal and vertical, which will mean the Gaussian blur will have an effect both vertically and horizontally, as the name suggests. But you can change this by clicking on here, and you can choose to split this up so your blur only affects the horizontal or the blur only affects the vertical. Let's try it with horizontal and vertical first. So I'll left click on my drag slider and take this up to around about 34. What's that, 34.3? My eyes are going. Anyway, that's what it looks like as horizontal and vertical. Notice now though, as I change this to horizontal, the blurring effect of course now changes from both axes, horizontal and vertical, to just the horizontal. Can you see the difference? It's relatively subtle, but what you will notice is despite us using exactly the same setting, because we are only using the horizontal for blurring, then it doesn't seem quite as blurred. The same applies if I choose vertical, in that the same amount of blurring occurs as the horizontal on its own, but here vertical in isolation makes the blur depth to be not as extreme as vertical and horizontal in combination. Anyway, I'll revert back to horizontal and vertical, mainly because I want you to notice right along the edges of our image, horizontally across the top and bottom, and vertically across the left and the right. It's almost as if a bevel effect has been created. We sort of have a rounding off at the edges. Well, unfortunately, that's an inevitable side effect of using this particular effect. We can combat this by using this reset edge pixels down here, this checkbox. Once I check in there, notice what happens. In fact, just before I do, I'll take the drag slider to the extreme, so this bevel effect is much more noticeable. And then now, if I come down to the repeat edge pixels checkbox and check in there, well, as you can see, the vertical and the horizontal edges become that much sharper. And what's happened is, Premiere Pro has sort of grabbed some of the pixels that run along the edges and duplicated them, or repeated them, as it says, to negate that beveled effect around the edges. Like this, it becomes a little bit more crisp. If we can talk about being crisp with this particular effect, a Gaussian blur. Anyway, that's what that does. I tend to use this all the time, to be quite honest. Even though it doesn't come on by default, I will switch it on pretty much every time I use a blur. Let's just revert back. That's what it's like without, and this is what it's like with. Okay, so that's the Gaussian blur. As we can see, it affects the whole of our image, and in fact I'm just going to remove it because I want to try a different one now, so that you can compare the difference. So I'll right click on Gaussian blur and run down to clear. It's this one I want to use, the one I referenced earlier on, channel blur. What this is going to allow me to do is choose a specific colour, or a colour range anyway, within our video clip, and only blur that particular colour range. I'll left click on it and drag it and drop it on our clip. Therefore now within our effect controls we see channel blur has been added, and we have a number of different parameters that we can adjust. And for our purposes in particular, we can adjust the red, the green or the blue blurriness within this particular video. Let's try the green first of all. You can see some green across here, across the sand dunes here. Bearing in mind I'm not simply isolating this green area, this will affect the green tonality range right across the clip. But if you do adjust this fairly sympathetically, then it can be quite useful. I'll show you what I mean. In fact, I'll show you what I mean by going the opposite way. If I drag this too far to the right, then you can see this really does have a detrimental effect to the clip, to the point that it's unusable. But if I'm much more subtle with this, I'll drag it to the left and take it down to about 20. Now even this is too much, and in fact I do need to click in there to repeat our edge pixels. That takes away that pinkish purple border, and in fact if I take this down much lower, close to about 0, around about 5, then you can see that we can blur the green pixels within our range, just to make it more subtle. Let's try it now with the blue. Be aware though that this scene is predominantly made up of blue. There's an awful lot of sea, and there is some blue in the sky, but let's try it out. I'll drag this to the right. Maybe even at 22 this is too much. Certainly we've got the problem with the border again. It's much worse here, up in the 70s. So I'm going to actually click in the repeat edge pixels once more. To be honest, I wish this was a default setting, that it was always on. I can't think of an occasion where I wouldn't want it. Okay, now I'm going to take this down again. And in fact I'm going to leave channel blur as it is. I'm just giving you a flavour of it here. So I'll come up to channel blur, right click and click on clear. Well, as we've just seen, using the channel blur filter does affect the whole of our image. Finally now I want to show you this filter, anti-alias. What this will do is help combat any problems with jagged edges within your clip and sort of soften the edges off so we don't get such a distinct harshness to those edges. and in fact if I come over to my viewing resolution, it's set at fit at the moment, so it automatically responds to the size my program monitor is. But if I increase this by clicking on here and changing up to 200%, i.e. doubling our clip's resolution, I'll be able to use the drag sliders here to navigate around and find an edge. And in fact I think I'll take this up to 400%, 4 times the clip's resolution, so that we can see this much more prominently. And if I find this building here, you can see across the edges what's often known as staircasing, where the edges of the roof sort of take on stepped pixels, which kind of ruins the edge. Well, the anti-aliasing filter will help combat this by softening that. I'll apply it, I'll left click and drag it on top of our clip. Now, as you can see up here in our effect controls, the anti-alias filter works in exactly the same way as the black and white filter, in that it's either on or it's off. There's no degree drag slider that we can use. As I say, it's either on or it's off. With it in place, if you want to toggle it off, click in here of course. I'll switch it back on, and I'll take my resolution back to fit, and of course now we don't notice it so much. But what is useful is we get a more softening of those edges by the fact that the anti-aliasing is sort of blurring those edges. Hence that's why it's within this blur and sharpen category. Okay, now I'm going to remove this one as well. I'll right click and run down to clear. Okay, I'm going to finish off here now that we've seen a couple of tutorials looking at the blur and sharpen effects. So with that, I'll leave it and I'll see you in the next one.